So this is a completely new kind of event. We are all participating in an experiment here tonight. And the nature of the experiment is this. Randy Lioz, who is the Braver Angels California State Coordinator, wrote an essay about the Kyle Rittenhouse shootings in Kenosha that we thought was so extraordinary that we wanted to share it and talk about it. It's a piece from a very unexpected perspective. And for me, the power of the essay was that it showed me clearly how I had viewed the event through my own biased lens, based on my own biased political perspective. And that was quite a shock, since I think of myself as a kind of reasonable person, as I bet most of us do. And it was a real wake-up call for me to remember that things are not always what they seem at first glance, and even more so that there's always more to the story. So the way we're going to organize this is that Randy will read a section from his essay, show some relevant videos, and pose a couple of simple questions for us. And then we'll open the floor for people to speak. If you want to speak, please raise your Zoom hand. So when Randy has finished one section, I'll invite speakers. We're not going to make an effort to alternate red and blue, because this isn't really a red-blue issue. Your speech may be a comment, a question for Randy, a question for the group, or something else. In the interest of getting more people to speak, we're going to limit comments to 1 minute. You don't have to address the chair the way we usually do. Just please do wait to be called upon to speak. We'll have 10 minutes of discussion for each section, and there'll be 5 sections. In the interest of keeping this a good experience for us all, please remember that we are speaking from our real heartfelt convictions or doubts, and we are not trying to convert one another or prove each other wrong. We follow the normal rules of politeness. We don't interrupt, we listen, we are respectful. We're trying to understand each other's experiences and feelings and beliefs. We're not trying to convert each other or argue. Just a heads up, I'm sure it will be no surprise to you to know that some of the video footage that Randy is going to show will be very violent. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Randy.
Okay, thanks very much, Susan.
You're welcome.
The events in Wisconsin late last month, I think, truly made our collective heart ache. Following a cycle of increasing polarization for decades on end, and the violent paroxysms of the past few months, the last week of August into September was a soul-rending chain of unmitigated pain. The horrific shooting of Jacob Blake set off a renewed wave of protests in which the ultimate price has been paid by supporters of each side. This felt, and still feels, like the most dangerous moment for our country that I have ever experienced, at least in my half a lifetime. And what creates this danger is our constant habit of viewing the actions of our opponents in the worst possible light in order to achieve our full moral separation, our maintenance of the view of ourselves as in the right and them in the wrong. We're constantly nudged one way or the other in our interpretation of the intentions and the motivations of those we disagree with. And when we add up all those little nudges, it puts us on the other side of a vast gulf. These are usually subtle distortions of the truth, and they don't, in fact, serve us the way we have intended. They just push us towards less understanding of our foes, while failing to sway the opinions of others toward our viewpoint. And most unmistakably, provoking the fierce defensiveness of those opponents. Let's take the case of Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old who was captured on video, shooting 3 people, killing 2 of them, during the protests against the Blake shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. To the left, he's a monster. He's a mass shooter who came to Kenosha looking for trouble and found it. And when confronted for it, took the cowardly way out. To the right, he's a patriot who came to help free the city of Kenosha from the violence and destruction of rioters, to support the police in their mission to keep the streets safe, to clean up after vandals, who even sought to give aid to anyone harmed that night on either side. Of course, neither of those images is even remotely complete, since the story of how Rittenhouse got into this situation is, as usual, complex and heartbreaking, and at points, even a bit pitifully funny. So I have some questions for the group And this doesn't involve video quite yet, but hopefully you folks are fairly familiar with the story of what happened. And so the questions are, is this a Rorschach test for our politics? Is this a situation in which whatever you're looking for in an incident, you can find it? Is it true that many other events, like the Covington Catholic case, if y'all remember that, I certainly thought the same thing of that case in the moment, or nearly all events that we see on TV. Is this true that it is that we see many Rorschach tests that basically whatever we are looking for, we can find? So with that, I'm going to stop my share, and I'm also going to keep the questions in front of you. What I'm going to do is to put the questions on my background, and so you'll be able to refer back to them. I know it's not big for everyone, but if you want to refer back to the questions, there they are. And I'm going to turn it back over to Susan to run the discussion.
Okay, so I am looking for a blue hand and I see Susan Rico. Susan, could you unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question or make your comment?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, no, I just want to say what an extraordinary essay that Randy wrote that was so powerful and one of the most just amazing things I've read in a long time. So kudos to Randy. I think he was honest in his approach to this. And yes, it's a Rorschach test in that I think we can all see ourselves clearly on one side or the other of this, but when you delve into the particulars of this event and many other events like Covington, when you watch the entire video, like it's a very long video, Ferguson, when you delve into all the details, I've done it on a few of these cases, not all of them, but when you delve into them deeply, they're always more complicated, and I can always see arguments on both sides that are valid. So that's all I have to say.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Susan. Vicky, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question or make your comment?
I think this will be rather comical because Randy drew a sort of polarization between the right and the left in their reactions to this. I had a different take altogether. But it shows that it is a Rorschach test, because what I took away from it was that this was a case of toxic masculinity. I didn't think of left or right. I thought, what a horrible problem these young men have, that they have to prove their masculinity. They have to carry guns and they have to shoot their guns. And some of the video that Randy came up with kind of showed that this was a male thing. He got himself involved in an argument about this woman. We don't know the background of that. But I just wanted to say that I think there are many different ways of looking at a situation and not just right or left. In my case, it was men versus women and toxic masculinity.
Absolutely, good point. Yeah. Does anybody else, Barbara, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself and tell us.
Yeah, I do think it is a Rorschach test. I think most everything that we experience is a Rorschach test in a way. I'm thinking of, for those of you that read The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt's idea that we go around looking for events that prove the narrative that that we want to promote. And when we see different events, we tend to look at them in terms of either proving or disproving that narrative. And it's easy for both sides to look at the same event and say, yeah, it's, it demonstrates our narrative. But I wanted to respond to something that Vicky said, because there is yet another way of looking at this aside from toxic masculinity. And that is, and I think Randy actually alluded to this, maybe even somewhat explicitly brought it out in his article, and that is that there is something missing in the lives of many young people today, and that is that sense of belongingness. I didn't see it much as a, toxic masculinity, but I mean, I could see there's an edge of that in this, that there's a need for young people to want to be part of something bigger than themselves. And it's difficult for them to find. And for young men, they do tend to be drawn towards the heroic image. And I think that was the case with Kyle Rittenhouse. He was a victim too. He was a victim of something missing in our society, in our communities now, that I think really needs to be rectified.
Thank you, Barbara, very much. I see Gordon has his hand raised. Gordon, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I don't know. I doubt very much whether the situation in my childhood was similar. Imagine I'm 14 years old and there is 5 of us on our bicycles. We have 22s slung on our backs, and we are riding out of town to go poking away with our guns, and people wave at us, said, "Have a good time, boys." No one concerned themselves. No one said anything. To see children with weapons, at least where I grew up in this town, was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Every pickup truck had a dog in the back and at least one rifle on the gun rack right behind the seat. That's changed somewhat, but I'm not quite, and it certainly is masculine as opposed to feminine. Although there are women who feel that way about guns now, but I'm hesitant to judge him simply because of his embrace of guns. Guns were fun.
Right.
That's my
Thank
childhood.
Thank you, Gordon. Does anybody else want to say anything or make a comment or ask a question? Okay, I think, Randy, let's move on to the next section. Vicky, I see your dog. Is that a dog or a cat? Oh, no, it's a cat. Okay, Randy.
This performance, as I think it can be accurately termed, started well before last week, with Rittenhouse getting into a fight on July 1st, which resulted in him punching a girl multiple times, caught on video. I don't know about any other history of violence he might have had, but I can imagine a scenario in which he saw this as one of his first real moments to make his presence felt by standing up to someone who had picked a fight with his friend. Never mind that someone was smaller than him. Fast forward to the day of the shootings, and you can see his tense excitement as he declares his role in the protection of property and safety to a reporter from the Daily Caller, Richard McGinnis, calling it his job and promising to rush into harm's way for anyone under threat, including the reporter himself. And now we have some video of that to watch, so here we go.
For people who are armed as well.
Protect me.
Gotcha. And then what about these guys up on the roof?
Their job is to provide overwatch and protect me also.
Gotcha.
They're protecting everybody on the run, protecting each other.
Understood. And
we're running medical, and we're going in and we're getting people.
And what about, are you from the area?
I am from the area.
What brought you out here tonight? You just wanted to provide medical attention?
Provide medical attention to people that need it. If somebody's injured, like you get hurt, I'm grabbing you.
Have you encountered any issues yet thus far with law enforcement or anything like that?
Yeah, we were trying to come and set a fire at the church. So we went to the church and we de-escalated the situation, telling them they need to leave or they will be detained and further arrested.
This church right over here?
That church right there. And we stomped the fire out all the way down at the school.
Wow. Do you think it would have been different if the police had a...
So just if you didn't hear him, he said that people were trying to set fire to the church, and they diffused that situation. All right, so I'm going to continue reading. We're running medical, and we're going in and getting people. Rittenhouse also claims to have helped stop 2 local buildings from being set ablaze. including a church, surmising that he and his group were able to de-escalate the situation more effectively than the police would have. And in fact, earlier in the day, he made an unambiguously positive contribution, helping to scrub graffiti off a local school, which might lend credence to the idea that even if he were inflating his sense of self-importance, he at least wished to use it for good. But as we continue following McGinnis's video, the role-playing gets even more absurd. Rittenhouse is joined by an older man who suggests they go see if there are any injuries they can attend to as medical personnel. That man turned out to be Ryan Balch, a follower of the Boogaloo Boy movement that has been preparing for a race war. They had met earlier in the day, and Balch apparently took him under his wing for a while. As we follow this walk, perhaps the most desperate and cringeworthy declaration of the night is uttered. And it comes not from Rittenhouse, but from the man who's taken charge of his well-being. Let's take a look at that.
Me and him are out here running and seeing if people need medical attention. But speaking of which, we need to go check, see if somebody got hurt again. All right.
Understood.
If you want to follow us, you're fine.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
And just a quick comment on that. He says, you want to follow us? You're following us. He definitely was craving the attention there of the reporter.
You're a certified EMT? Yeah. Gotcha. And do you work as an EMT normally?
Yes, sir. I just got the thing. I'm a lifeguard normally. I got my ALS.
Gotcha.
And I'm former Army infantry, and I got a whole bunch of travel training.
All right, I'm going to pause it there. I'm going to continue to read the piece. McGinnis is asking the 17-year-old about his EMT credentials, which Rittenhouse is clearly inflating. He's actually just a lifeguard with some emergency training, a far cry from a real emergency medical technician, but then declines to inquire about Balch. So after a beat, Balch offers up, and I'm forward Army infantry. By the way, I in retrospect, I recognize that I got that wrong. He says I'm former Army infantry, so apologize for that. And I got a whole bunch of some sort of training. In this exchange, we can see an entire universe of insecurities represented, with both the underage kid with a gun and the man accompanying him, who had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, desperate to be recognized for their importance and experience.
Yeah. Does anybody need medical? Medical.
What, yesterday or today?
Today. Dude, he just had up the gun. Talking about get off the car. Now he's talking about medical.
What car over in the dealership? Sorry, I don't know.
So the scene takes its first dark turn as we see Rittenhouse announcing medical in another awkward attempt to be taken seriously as a courageous defender of public safety. As he walks up to a group of young black men, we immediately get a clearer picture of what he's been up to earlier in the day. One of them tells McGinnis that Rittenhouse had shooed him away from a car at gunpoint. By this time, having been confronted with this, Rittenhouse has already moved on, not denying the accusation, but continuing to shout offers of medical help. So we've got some discussion questions here. So first of all, how relevant are Rittenhouse's actions earlier in the day or month to understanding his intentions, including the fight and the school graffiti cleanup? And my additional question is, can those who believe that he was guilty of wrongfully shooting those protesters still give him credit for wanting to protect and improve the community? And the next question is, do we believe that hanging around white supremacists cast guilt upon Kyle? Was it his responsibility to check out anyone he's been hanging out with at the protests? Is that even realistic? And bear in mind that he's a 17-year-old looking for approval and acceptance, and Balch is an adult with military experience.
Okay, does anybody have a comment or a question? I'm looking for blue hands. Yeah, oh wait, no, sorry, I thought that somebody was raising their actual hand. No comments, no questions.
I see Deborah Lafferty.
Oh, there we go, Deborah, I'm sorry. Deborah, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, if there were any people in the space where Kyle is that actually were in need of medical attention or help. He's offering it and calling it out and everything, but were there people there that were in need? I'm just curious.
Yeah, from what I saw earlier in the day or the night, he had actually given some medical attention to at least one person. I think maybe more than one. So yeah, there were people who needed medical attention. I think there were various people, including actually a figure that we'll see later, Gage Grosskreutz, who had a gun, but he also had a medical pack, and I believe he also attended to someone earlier in the day.
Marietta, would you go ahead and unmute yourself and tell us what you'd like to say or ask?
Sure. This may not be the place that you're looking for such a comment, but I'm just struck so hard by the tragedy, just the tragedy of this young man who was influenced and perhaps needed some sort of parental input or some other mentoring other than just being out there apparently alone and potentially influenced by the situation and by people that are there. I do believe his intentions probably were. I can see that they may have been benign and positive, but it's just a situation that's so fraught with danger. I can't understand how someone in his life couldn't have influenced him to not be there in such a situation without some sort of accompaniment by a person that he knew and trusted.
Thank you, Marietta.
And
Susan, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, if I could just add one thing to that. We are going to be discussing that a little bit in a later section, but there's the Washington Post video compilation does address some of that, and so if anyone hasn't seen that already, I would highly suggest that you check it out because, yeah, it addresses a lot of that, I think, fairly directly.
And oh, by the way, there are no comments that are out of line, as long as they're in the braver angel spirit. Susan.
Oh, yes. So I totally hear Marietta and what she's saying, but I'm not sure his intentions were totally benign or benevolent, in that there was some indication earlier on that he was looking for some fame out of this event, like there was a craving for recognition or fame. So I think in that maybe that addresses the question, or is earlier actions and words relevant? And I think they are in context. So I do understand he thought he was wanting to do good, but I think there was a deeper issue of wanting some attention.
Thank you, Susan. Barbara, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is a question kind of in response to Marietta. I thought I read somewhere that his mother actually drove him there. Does anybody
that
hear
was a
that
rumor
or read that somewhere?
That was a rumor that was unsubstantiated.
Okay.
Yeah, that is not what happened.
Okay, good. Well, I'm happy to hear that. As a mother, I couldn't imagine.
Randy, what was his exact comment about wanting to be famous? I think that's in your article as well.
Yeah, so he did post something on his social media accounts that said just trying to be famous, something like that.
On his Instagram or TikTok?
Yeah, I think it might have been TikTok. Yeah.
Okay, I see Mariana has her hand raised. Mari, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks. I completely agree with Susan, but I also, looking at this video again, I'm kind of thinking now that the reporter might have exacerbated, or his actions might have been more relevant than I previously thought, because it just seemed like Kyle was in more so of a place to go along with what he was originally thinking, and it might have been his questions, like the reporter's questions, that made him say some of the stuff because he had that attention. And I'm just questioning now if he would have said some of those things if the reporter wasn't there.
Yeah. Thank you. Vicky, go ahead and unmute yourself.
This is a small point, but if you look at the video about his helping to erase the graffiti, he is looking back at the camera while he's doing it. You know, like, hi, it's me doing this good deed. And that sort of rubbed me the wrong way, that if he was really that interested in doing the graffiti, he should have been dealing with it. What I didn't notice was what kind of graffiti it was and whether it was a left or a right kind of stance that it took. But I felt like he was doing a performance rather than sincerely doing the deed itself.
Thank you. Wendy, you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and make your comment?
Do we know how he got the gun? Because he's 17. Should he have been able to buy a gun?
Yeah, that's actually a complex aspect of the story itself. So he had a local friend. So he lives in Illinois, but actually frequently visited the Kenosha area, and he has a friend there whose dad had. So he actually took his stimulus money, his stimulus check, to buy the weapon, but his friend's dad required him to keep it locked up in his house, so he wouldn't be able to access it except for like target practice under a completely supervised environment. And the dad had actually taken it out of the safe because he was, I guess he was because of what was going on in the town. He felt safer having the gun in the house, and that's the reason that Kyle was actually able to get access to the gun. And the dad was super angry when he found out that Kyle had taken the gun without asking him.
So the gun belonged to the friend's dad, or it belonged to Kyle?
I think I don't remember the exact detail. I think his friend might have done a straw purchase for him,
Yes, that's what
but
happened.
with the understanding that Kyle would never have access to that gun without supervision until his 18th birthday.
Thank you. Chip, I see your hand raised.
Hi. Thank you to all who are participating. I appreciate the goodwill. I have trouble wrapping my head around, and I recognize Kyle's 17 years old, so he's not perhaps thinking things through to a logical end. But I have trouble understanding this idea of wanting to provide medical support, and he came with a gun. And I'm thinking of the many people who served in the military who were conscientious objectors and put themselves in harm's way, armed only with medical kit. Now, I don't expect Kyle to know all of that, but it's just very difficult to get my head around the paradox of, I brought a gun, but I'm here to provide medical care. I think his interest in fame overrides everything else, I'm afraid, but I'm being judgmental.
We have time for one more comment. Deborah, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I don't feel that his need for fame or his expressions of wanting to be a hero, or it's actually to be seen. And I don't see there anything in that itself negative or anti-benevolent or whatever we're saying about him. We're seeing this young man is isolated, confused, maybe has mental health issues. Anyway, I just want to say that his strong need to be seen and to do good too, maybe in a confused way. It breaks my heart what happened. Seeing this young man, 17 years old, he's not seen, he's alienated, he's isolated. He's living in a culture where he's not seen, he's craving that. And he sees this moment where he thinks he can actually do good. It's actually quite heartbreaking.
Yeah, thank you. So
I
Randy,
absolutely agree with you, and I'll certainly have more to say about that as we continue. So I'm going to once again, go to my shared screen. McGinnis was still with Rittenhouse when the night went fully south, beginning with his confrontation with his first victim, Joseph Rosenbaum. And here's where we encounter one of the main problems standing in the way of a clear-eyed understanding of what happened and why. To get such an understanding requires progressives be willing to take a fair look at Rittenhouse's claim of self-defense, even as we maintain a healthy skepticism of the motivations of many of those touting it. And to do that requires that we actually look at the people he shot, especially the first.
Shoot me! Shoot me! Bust on me!
We should certainly take into account the fact that Rosenbaum was chasing Rittenhouse across a parking lot. And in the moment right before the fatal shooting, another person in that lot clearly fired a gun into the air. And the only close-up eyewitness account of the shooting has the victim grabbing for the gun of the shooter to take it from him. Now, this is a video that has the entire incident from multiple camera angles. So it takes a lot of the available cell phone footage that was taken that night and sews it together, synchronizes it, and allows us to see as much as we can see in this instance. Now, I just another warning that we kind of went back and forth about how much of this to show, and we decided that, you know, it's very important to the discussion. So I'm gonna be showing the video mostly in its entirety, and I'm gonna stop and point out relevant aspects of the video as we go. So hopefully that'll work out as a presentation technique.
Damn.
So what's relevant there is that people were destroying cars in that used car lot. The banging, the clanging that you heard was people hitting cars with like baseball bats and whatever else they had around. They were trying to destroy those cars. This is the moment when we pan over to where Rosenbaum is about to give chase to Rittenhouse, and there's some pretty good evidence that he has actually mistakenly associated with him with someone who he encountered earlier in the night who was trying to extinguish dumpster fires. And so this is when the incident kicks off. So here's Kyle right here, and this is Rosenbaum. And you can see in his right hand is a plastic bag. He had actually gone to the store to try to pick up his medication, but he wasn't able to, but he had other stuff in the bag from the store. So this is when this chase starts.
Oh, he got a gun! He got a gun!
All right, so you're about to hear the sound of gunfire, one shot that is going to come from the left side over here. Okay, so there was someone in the crowd that fired a gun into the air. You see Kyle over here. You see Rosenbaum right here chasing him. And then right behind them is going to be Richard McGinnis, the reporter who had been talking to them earlier in the night. Okay, so and it is tough to see exactly what happens. The camera actually shakes a little bit just at the moment when Kyle fires at Joseph for the first time. And that was the gunshot from over here. Okay, that poppy you just heard. And so Kyle at that moment turns around, and the gunshot that he just heard comes from basically the same direction as the guy who was chasing him. Okay, and then and McGinnis I think is right about here, and apparently McGinnis after the first shot from Kyle thought he had been shot because he felt something on his leg, and it might have been debris as a bullet kicked up some debris from the ground. So you can see the moment when Rosenbaum goes down. Here's McGinnis. Rosenbaum is now lying right here, and Kyle has doubled back around this car and is about to check out what he has done. Now there's going to be 3 more shots, and we don't know where those came from, but the fact is there's been gunfire that has been happening in the streets kind of all night. And we're going to see that even later in the video. So McGinnis is taking off his shirt and trying to wrap up wounds, and Kyle takes out his phone. He was calling his friend, last name Black, that had given him the gun. They're saying,
This dude running did it.
So this is all happening in real time.
Take screenshots. That dude shot him. That nigga just shot that dude.
Where?
Cranium that boy. He just shot a man.
He's right here in his head.
And also what's relevant is there is a little bit of a head wound, but he was grazed by a bullet in his head. The real shot that killed Jojo Rosenbaum was actually in his back, from what I saw, and nobody saw that because he was lying on his back. And so they thought it was the most dangerous thing was a head wound. And so that's what they were addressing. Come on! He shot it! So Gage Grosskreutz is, he's the guy who I mentioned earlier, who has a medic kit and a handgun with him, okay? And this is his cell phone. He was live. He was broadcasting live at this point. So that's very relevant for a little bit later in the video.
Shot. Hey, what are you doing? You shot somebody?
I want to get police.
Who shot? Who shot? Hey, stop him!
So someone has just punched Kyle in the back of the head, I believe. All right, so what's about to happen, Kyle has just gone down. This guy is going to drop kick him, and then the second person who he wound up killing, Anthony Huber, is going to come from the left side with his skateboard, and he's going to actually try to take the gun from Kyle. So this is Anthony Huber trying to reach for the gun as he is hitting Kyle with his skateboard, and he hits him in the back of the head. And that was unfortunately the fatal shot. This is Gage Grosskreutz, who we saw asking him a few seconds ago, who's shot? This guy has a medic kit, but he also has a gun in his right hand. So he had put up his hands at first, and then he lowered his hand to take a shot at Kyle, and that's when Kyle shot him, apparently. So here's him with his hands up, and then he goes to shoot Kyle. And what's also relevant in my mind is this guy realizes that he is not going to be able to confront Kyle. And so he backs off, and Kyle does not attack him.
Shit, people are getting shot all around us. People are just getting shot everywhere, guys.
And that is Gage Grosskreutz yelling out that he needs a medic because he was shot in the arm. It was a pretty bad gunshot wound.
Move! Take this. Take this. Take this, move!
I need a fucking medic! Everybody get on the back!
And so Kyle is right now putting his hands up to try to surrender to the police. And they have gotten a report of gunshots, so they're about to go check out the scene. And nobody really knows. The police don't know who the shooter is. So they just see some kid in the street who is getting in their way.
Hey, he just shot them! Hey, dude right here just shot them!
he just shot all them down there. That dude just shot them right there. That dude right here. Yeah.
Someone injured straight ahead. Get out of the road! Get down there!
So they're just telling him to get out of the road. Okay. So what I wrote was, in the scene that followed, it's also pertinent that Rittenhouse was being chased by a group that was trying to disarm him and received a drop kick followed by a skateboard to the head as one person tried to grab his gun and another approached him with a pistol. With a situation like this, I think it's important to look inward. With all of these factors piling up, who do we think we'd be in this situation? We can choose to assume the best of ourselves as we think the worst of Rittenhouse, but I think that's a disingenuous approach. Sure, what you're thinking now, if you're a progressive like me, is a fair point. We wouldn't be in the middle of a hostile crowd with an AR-style long gun. But what this points to is that the conversation should seriously focus around why he was there in the first place, to the points that were brought up earlier. And our reactions to this catastrophe point to the very reason anyone would be there in the first place. We have come to embrace only the aspects of the story that support our narrative, and it amps up the rage on both sides to the point where we're driven blind to any nuance. This bullied boy, who had come to Kenosha convinced that he was doing right by history and those around him, found himself in an utterly terrifying situation, and he did exactly what we would expect him to do. So here are the questions. What do you think that you would do in this situation? And does it align with what you think is morally right? What I kind of wonder is, how many people have done thought experiments like this, trying to imagine themselves in certain situations, perhaps the news or historical situations, to think about whether they would do the right but difficult thing? And how many of you, if you have done a thought experiment like that, came away from it feeling better about yourself, more confident that you would have been on the right side of history? And I think this is really relevant to what I think perhaps either Susan or Marietta brought up before about the influences that Kyle was subject to. Has the proliferation of videos with real violence desensitized us to it and made it easier to pull the trigger? So with that, I'm going to stop my share and go back to the discussion. I'll put the questions up on my background. And Susan, you can go ahead and take it away.
Okay, I'm looking for some blue hands here. I don't see any. So I'll say something, which is, when I watched this video and I saw Kyle down on the ground with people coming at him, I realized to my dismay that had I had a gun, I would have been so scared out of my mind that I would have shot. At that moment, I saw self-defense. And I think to myself, if I were 17 and had the background that he had, I can't imagine making a different decision than that. So I will hush up and invite Susan Rico to speak. Unmute yourself, Susan. Go ahead.
Yes, I hear, Susan, what you're saying about the self-defense, and I feel in his position, I would feel the same. I also feel that those who saw him running away and hearing what he had done might have thought they were stopping a mass shooting. So I think I can empathize on both sides of that.
Yeah. Thank you. Carrie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that the most striking thing to me was when Kyle was walking down the street with a humongous gun and the police heard that there was somebody shot, and they looked at him and said, "Step aside, young man." I imagine race will be part of this discussion, and maybe I'll kick it off. Had he been black, I don't know if he would have lasted 10 seconds. He probably would have been shot 50 times over, you know? And so that knowledge that Kyle knew he'll be protected by the police because he had that privilege probably helped him come to the decision that, yeah, it's okay to be there because I have law enforcement on my side, which is tragic in so many ways. So that's my comment.
And Susan, I just wanted to point out that Phil was trying to raise his hand, but can't do it because he's a co-host. So.
Oh, Phil, I'm sorry. Then I'll put you in the front of the line since I missed you. Phil, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Randy. So I, like many people, I was struck by the overlapping tragedies on view here in this incredibly tightly packed series of videos that Randy showed. So there's putting aside for a second the tragedy of Kyle Rittenhouse and putting aside for a second the tragedy of his victims, there is in the background the tragedy of America's cities is also evident here. So it's no accident that Rittenhouse and Walsh, the older guy with the gun, when they're having the earlier discussion, talk to one another as if they're about to walk into a war zone. That's exactly the conversation they had. What's your equipment? What's your training? And then, having had their rifles slung loosely by their side, they raise them slightly and do what's called covering the trigger. They're ready. And then they walk down the block. Everybody on this call has seen those kind of blocks where you're smart enough to know, don't turn around and go back. There are those kind of blocks in every American city, almost every one. This particular night on that block, as Randy has pointed out, there were cars being set on fire and smashed. There were dumpster fires being set, and there was random gunshots everywhere. It was a war zone. Where were the police, you may ask? They show up at the end of the video in armored cars. There are American cities where the police can only go in armored cars. That's a useful thing to think about. To me, it's particularly telling because I saw exactly the same scenes in exactly the same unfolding in exactly the same way in 1968 when I was in the middle of the Newark riots. They looked exactly the same.
Phil, I'm going to stop you there for a second because we're a little bit over time. That's been
Thank
about
you.
2 minutes.
No, thank you,
Thank
Susan.
you for that comment. And we have Vicky would like to say something. Vicky, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I suppose this shows my filtering system, but to me, this shows the tragedy of having guns in America. Guns are meant to be in military situations and hunting situations, none of which apply in this case. And those who are supposed to have guns in a normal country would be trained to use those guns and not to panic. That's exactly what military training does to you. And but this gun was in the hands of a 17-year-old. It should never have been. Of course, he acted the way we would expect him to as a 17-year-old, but he should not have had a gun. It should not have been that easy for him to get a gun.
Thank you, Vicky. Barbara, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, to Phil's point, I mean, to me, watching that, it looked like a third world country or a war zone, and the fog of war, a fog of war type situation where there was gunfire, there were cars being ignited. And in a situation like that, someone who isn't trained, or sometimes even someone who is going to probably take the most aggressive action possible to protect themselves or to save themselves. But it goes back to something that we all, many of us have brought up before. How does one come to be in that situation? And not just Kyle Rittenhouse, any of the people there doing what they were doing. In those videos, there were no peaceful protesters, or at least there didn't seem to be peaceful protests going on. What gives rise to a situation like that, where peaceful protest is justified, but looting, burning cars, creating a semblance of a war zone. I don't think any of us believe that's justified, but it happened all over the country. And why that happened, I think, is an underlying question that we need to explore. Probably not in this call, but at some point. I think we all need to think about that.
Thank you, Barbara. Gordon, you had something you wanted to say. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Well, I'm sure not going to bring here any solutions, but I think we should face the things that we cannot change. There will be guns in America. There are guns in America, and there will be guns in America. They cannot be taken away. There's over 300 million of them, many not registered, my own included. It's not going to happen. Just as if we are not going to say it is too bad that people get addicted to drugs. I wish there were no drugs, illegal drugs. That's not going to happen either. We're going to, I wish there wasn't adultery, but it happens. We should accept that which we cannot change and look for ways to mitigate it and deal with the underlying problems here. But chasing after guns is not a solution, not worthwhile spending at least my time on.
Thank you, Gordon. Carrie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So I've heard a number of people say that it looked like a war zone. And I've personally never been to war, but I've seen footage of war in like Serbia, Syria, and those images don't even come close to a war zone. It reminded me of when this Super Bowl 19, the 49ers won, my town erupted. There were people in the streets. There were people banging on things. There were probably some fights. That wasn't a war zone. I think that was a constitutionally protected freedom of speech to say, I'm upset. And so let's say you break a car window saying, I'm upset. There's penalties for that, and it's certainly not being shot, so there's laws and rules to handle property damage. And so I see this view of Kyle and the fascination of his persona, yet the whole reason for the protest was that Black people were being killed en masse without looking at their persona. They were just walking down the street, boom, they're shot. The kid has a toy gun, boom, they're shot. And we don't delve into the lives of those people. George Floyd had a rich history of good and bad, and that doesn't seem to be discussed because He doesn't look like an adorable child. I guess the problem is that there are some Black children who were killed that were also adorable, and that Kyle seems to be given this grace. And I think the tragedy is that the other adorable Black kids weren't afforded this grace. Wouldn't it be wonderful if those young Black youths could have been given the grace that was given to Kyle, the forgiveness of walking down the street with a rifle during a protest? He wasn't killed. And wouldn't it be a wonderful place again if the police didn't have a history of violence towards Black people? That seems to be what the whole protest was about in the first place. So I don't want to lose sight of the fact of the reason why people were out in the streets in the first place was reflected in what happened with Kyle.
Thank you. Chip, go ahead, unmute yourself. Yeah.
I guess the observation I would make, though, about whether that was a war zone or not, is the fact that in a war zone, everybody's armed. And clearly in that video, not everybody was armed. And so, you know, you have this toxic mix of people with guns and people without guns, and a confused young man, I would say, it to be charitable, in Kyle Rittenhouse. So I guess I would say then further that while I do not think America will ever be a country of low gun ownership, it's also true that a majority of Americans are willing to have some more control over guns, so that perhaps it's a little bit more difficult for a 17-year-old to be carrying an AR long gun. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Chip. Susan.
Just a brief comment about the AR guns. When I for a living, I design weapon sights for the Army, including weapon sights for long guns like AR-15s and even more serious weapons, like serious weaponry. The AR-15, I don't mean to segue into a different subject, but that weapon does not, and I come from the right, I'm libertarian, I'm very libertarian and pro-gun rights, but the AR-15 has no business in the hands of a kid like that, none whatsoever, nor in the hands of anybody that I know personally, none. Sorry.
No, thank you. Does anybody else? May I make a comment in relation to what Carrie said, which is here we are looking, scrutinizing Kyle Rittenhouse's life. Why aren't we scrutinizing George Floyd's life, or Breonna Taylor's life, or Tamir Rice's life? And to me, it's because there's so obvious who was in the wrong. There's no two points of view. The cops were in the wrong. But here, I mean, what would you say to try to put any blame at all on Tamir Rice? I couldn't think of anything. You know, so like, what's to scrutinize? He was flat out murdered. But this Kyle story is somewhat more complex, I think. And from my standpoint anyway, that's why it's worth scrutinizing, because it's so easy to just say he's a bad guy or he's a good guy, depending on your political perspective. But Tamir Rice, you know, George Floyd, what's the other? There's only one point of view that makes any sense, and that is that they were done in by the cops. You know what I mean? Anyway, and Carrie, did you want to make another comment?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I had a Braver Angels one-on-one, a red and blue conversation, which was really awesome. This young lady who recently turned from blue to red and was dating a police officer. And on the second session, we started talking about Black Lives Matter. And this young lady who was totally nice, very, very reasonable, respectful, had no qualms saying that George Floyd's death was not cut and dry, that there was plenty of things that could point to George Floyd being complicit, and that it was, again, not cut and dry, you know. So to me, it feels cut and dry, but I think that's the whole point of Braver Angels, is that we come here thinking, wow, I totally believe in one thing. And it turns out other people, other reasonable people, think completely differently. And I think that's an important point, that we not fall into the trap of not discussing George Floyd because we think it's clear. And I'm here to report from this wonderful one-on-one session, it's not. There's plenty of people who disagree and believe as firmly on the other side. So maybe we should be having conversations about George Floyd too.
I would personally love that. Yeah. Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that what Carrie just said is definitely a reflection of what I understand, and with regard to all of the names that you mentioned, there are people who believe that, you know, those cases are not cut and dry, and I have read reasonable arguments, not necessarily that I agree with, but arguments that come from a place of reason that can argue as such. But even beyond those cases, just our viewpoint of what was going on in Kenosha that weekend or that week. So, I mean, there's compilations of all of the burned out cars and burned out structures, and the city essentially in flames the day before, and it's essentially based on the news sources that we surround ourselves with. That if you come from one perspective, and that perspective is constantly being reinforced, you would absolutely believe that Kenosha was a complete war zone that weekend, and I could totally understand why you would believe that. And I think it's a reasonable belief. And so when Kyle says, I'm here to provide medical assistance, I think it's totally understandable that he says, but I'm carrying my gun because I could get hurt, because I could be in a dangerous situation. And I think he fully believed that. And I think that it is understandable that he believed that, because he was seeing certain things. So I think there's just so many things that we can say that about, that our narrow perspective does not encompass what a lot of other people see.
Thank you, Randy. That's, I guess, the whole point of this discussion, isn't it? Yeah. Wendy, you had something you wanted to say, and that I think that'll be our last question for this segment.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about the way it was the Kyle Rittenhouse thing was reported. I didn't look into it, deeply, but I certainly, and I wasn't. I mean, I was reading it in my local town paper, or maybe on some, New York Times breaking news update or something. I feel like it was certainly presented in a very non-nuanced way, as if he had just gone in. I mean, this is my impression, was that he just went in there wantonly shooting people. That was the impression I came away with. And I will say that it did not really occur to me to look into it any more deeply. And I really have to hand it to you, Randy, that you did, because this is very enlightening. I mean, we have to be careful what we read. We can't just take it at face value, even if we're reading it in a, like a, what seems like a mainstream news source.
Right. Thank you, Wendy. I guess it's time to move on to the next segment.
Indeed it is. And I actually want to go back to Jojo Rosenbaum. So this is from an earlier part of the essay. But refusing to look at the negative aspects of a victim is not the same as impartially weighing the circumstances of the violence. When trying to piece together what happened that night and evaluate Rittenhouse's self-defense claim, evidence of what Rosenbaum did in his final moments is key. We don't know yet, and may never know, what he did. But we do know that earlier in the night, he belligerently confronted armed militia members, daring them to shoot him. And we watched that earlier. But let's take a look at some other aspects of Rosenbaum's story.
Joseph Rosenbaum moved to Kenosha 2 years ago. He met Carrie Ann Swart in 2019.
He really, really loved me. And when he loved deeply. He loved his family, you know. I mean, he was a very, you know, wholehearted, genuine, put everything in, you know, loyal. If your friend is in a fight, you're in a fight.
Raised in Texas and Arizona, Rosenbaum had a chaotic upbringing. His mother was sent to prison when he was 13. A family member molested him, quote, on an almost daily basis, according to statements he later made to law enforcement authorities. While living in group homes and shelters, Rosenbaum began using heroin and methamphetamine. After a conviction for sexual conduct with minors at age 18, he spent more than a decade in prison, a stretch marked by repeated disciplinary infractions, according to prison records. Rosenbaum struggled in Kenosha. For 7 months, he and Swart lived in a tent behind a shop before they moved into a motel.
When you live through such an experience like that with somebody, it's like 10 years. Like, I always say, like, if you can live in a tent with somebody and, like, not, like, end up hating each other by the end, like, okay, it's pretty good. You know, things, you know, you got a pretty solid future.
Rosenbaum eventually proposed, but their relationship was marked by strife.
Kenosha 911, what's the address of your emergency?
On July 18th, Kenosha police responded to a call about domestic violence involving Swart and Rosenbaum.
Dude just basically went off, she's bleeding everywhere and bruises on her. And
according to court records and interviews with Swart and a witness, Rosenbaum yelled at Swart and body slammed her to the ground. He was arrested and 2 days later released, under order not to contact Swart.
He got angry at one point in time, you know, suffering from untreated mental illness. So I'm not excusing his behavior at all. Yeah, it happened, you know, absolutely, it was domestic violence.
On July 25th, Rosenbaum sent this text message to Swart. An hour later, he overdosed in front of a McDonald's in Kenosha. He called a crisis hotline.
I have a call from Med 4 Truck 7. Med 4 Truck 7 respond for an overdose at McDonald's, 7060 Green Bay Road, 7060 Green Bay Road, again for an overdose. Kenosha Fire Clear at 1655.
He was actually in ICU for 5 days and they did not think he was going to live.
Rosenbaum regained consciousness and on July 29th was taken to jail for violating the order to stay away from Swart. He was jailed for 3 weeks. Rosenbaum was released August 20th and spent a few days at CARE, a local mental health facility, before seeking additional help at the Aurora Psychiatric Hospital just outside Milwaukee, according to Swart.
He really just wanted to, you know, stay on his medication, stay on the right path.
On the morning of the 25th, the smell of smoke wafted through downtown Kenosha as the city braced for another day of unrest. At about 9 a.m., Rosenbaum called Swart and said he was preparing to leave the hospital, she said.
I don't necessarily think he wanted to leave, because when he called me and told me he was leaving, I'm like, really? He's like, I knew you were going to be shocked. He's like, I was surprised too.
As Rittenhouse and Black took up their positions, Rosenbaum was connecting with Swart at the motel where she lived and cleaned rooms. They talked for nearly 3 hours.
He seemed very, he was very apologetic. He just really wanted to prove to me that he could be the person that I deserved.
About 9:40 p.m., Rosenbaum left Swart. She was adamant he couldn't stay with her that night, fearful he would be arrested for contacting her. Swart warned Rosenbaum to stay away from downtown and avoid trouble.
As far as that night, I have absolutely no idea why he was downtown. None whatsoever.
So what I realized after watching this was that I was too busy offloading blame from Kyle for his poor choices. I forgot to extend the same courtesy to JoJo. In an earlier draft of the article, after seeing his shoot me video, but before I knew anything about him, I had written that Rosenbaum needed better friends who would stop him from being such an asshole. But I was wrong. We failed JoJo. He needed us, and we utterly abandoned him. He was a sexual abuse victim who became an abuser and a bully. He was angry, depressed, and probably scared, especially that day when he was pushed out of the mental hospital and then told by his fiancée that he had to go out on the street rather than be seen around her because of the legal consequences. We literally put a mentally ill person on the street and then told him he had to stay away from the only person he knew that he loved. I was angry with harsh judgment at the person who made the decision to put him back out on the street. And then I realized that they're working within the constraints of a system. And that system has failed because we can't trust each other anymore. And so we can't get anything done to help people like this. But you know who else the system failed? Kyle Rittenhouse. He was bullied out of high school and ended up doing online homeschooling. And he encountered a bully who himself was a victim, and that pain exploded all over the streets of Kenosha. Our hatred and distrust for one another created both of these situations, which brought these men together that night. So, my questions. Does the real blame for this whole incident lie with a broken system? And how much blame can we lay at our own feet for our inability to put our differences aside to help those in need?
Does anybody want to say anything? Carrie, go ahead.
I think this is the reason why Braver Angels exists. It is so that we can say, I'm not 100% at fault, but the part that I am at fault, I will take. And because I have fault, I have the ability to change. So I'm going to work to make things better. Things are awful and people are struggling, but that I have some influence and power, and where I choose to put it needs to be where there's problems. And I think this sheds light on some pretty important problems. We're talking about Kyle Rittenhouse, but it seems like it's trivial since there's probably thousands and thousands of other Kyle Rittenhouses that are ready to explode, and that we can do stuff to prevent it. We can do stuff to make people's lives better, and that the mission of Braver Angels to be able to listen to one another is a requirement. We can't just say, I know I have the solution, you're bad, I'm right, and I'm going to force this solution on you. The solution has to come from all sides because it's going to take the work of all sides. And I think it's going to take humility and courage to try to make a dent in this problem. But I think it's worthwhile.
Thank you, Carrie. I see that we're getting close to closing time, and we have one more segment to do. So let's just take one more comment from Gordon, and then we'll move on to the next segment.
I don't think the system is broken. I think it's imperfect. It reflects society and it reflects who we are. Locking up people with mental problems has difficulties in that we take away rights that we extend to everyone else. We reallocate money for I think, foolish purposes, but it's very difficult to get any money in the public system to be reallocated. So I don't think that something is broken. I think that our collective system of welfare is simply a reflection of the imperfection of humans who make up that society.
Thank you, Gordon. Randy, should we move on to section 5?
Happy to. So each of us, from progressives to pro-Trump conservatives, must come to terms with the fact that the other side's belief in our side's compliance and complacence with the rise of fascism is sincere, and that this is a problem. Indeed, that very polarization is how fascism wins, by convincing everyone involved that each provocation from their opponents must be met with equal force, lest they be emboldened. But we can break that cycle by choosing to judge with more humanity the actions of those who oppose us, to see them as the flawed humans that they and we are. This is not to draw false equivalence. Each of our tribes has made no secret that they abhor that. And I have no doubt about which side of the debate I'm on. But believing in one's own righteousness does not require demonization of those who you see as committing unjust acts. Some progressives argue that oppressors should be denounced and exposed as violent monsters. They argue that this was the strategy of Dr. King's nonviolent resistance to win over the moderate middle. But I think this misses the point of King's philosophy, and that of his intellectual forebears. They stood firm in the face of violence and made it very visible to the public, so society was able to look upon itself. Their words were important too, but those words didn't tear others down. They called them up to join the beloved community, to invite even their oppressors to join in that community when it is realized. This philosophy hinges on a universal potential for redemption, which I see as a core component of humanity. To call someone an evil monster based on the reaction to a provocation is to not only deny their humanity, but to further assert that because of the difference in our DNA, that we are incapable of the sins of our enemies. But human behavior is a product of experience and circumstances, more so, I believe, than genetics, and leaning on the concept of evil to explain it denies our own potential for extreme acts of good or bad. This is the most classic of cognitive distortions, as we're so fiercely protective of our self-images, but believing ourselves immune from humankind's most acute fallibility is the quickest path to our own fall. What does this mean for our outreach to those who we see as fallen? For myself, to truly live the principles of the philosophy of King and his ilk, to truly behave as though I believe in the possibility of redemption for all, means that there is no line for me, no ideological distance I will refuse to bridge. And I just wanted to add a note about the concept of evil. As a relevant side note, Kyle is reported to have seen people rioting on TV the night before and called them monsters. My involvement with Braver Angels has reinforced for me that regardless of the distance, I will always believe in the value of reaching out to someone, of trying to understand them. I would have that conversation with an open mind to their perspective, with no expectation of changing their mind about their actions, regardless of how deep their sins. So here is the discussion question. Am I right? Is it always worth reaching out to someone?
Would anybody like to make a comment?
Marietta, I see your hand up.
Sure. Randy, I have a thought about this, and it has to do with victims, people who are manipulated, and people who intentionally manipulate others for their own personal gain. I know it's extremely difficult and perhaps impossible to look at someone's motives and incentives, but if perhaps it was really evident that someone was specifically manipulating people who are vulnerable, people who are easily influenced for their own monetary gain, or for the purpose of gaining power, influence, and other things, Do you consider it worthwhile to reach out to someone like that, knowing, well, anticipating perhaps that they might simply try to deny it, but that their actions and words and other circumstances would point to that, that is their actual purpose?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that. I think there's always a chain of causation. So when we look at Jojo Rosenbaum, for example, should he be excused for being a quote unquote child molester? Well, I mean, I think we have to look at the fact that he was molested himself as a child. And so that doesn't mean that I would excuse his behavior and or condone it, obviously, but it does mean that I would reach out to him and try to understand his experience. And I think that's entirely relevant. And I cannot think of a person on earth in history, and this is me personally, right? So, but I would always want to hear someone's story, someone's experiences that led them down a very dark road.
Chip. Go ahead.
Thank you. That's a great question. Is it always worth reaching out? I guess we all have to decide that for ourselves. I just want to say I admire all of you for wanting to reach out and to have a big open minds, which is, I find personally very hard to keep an open mind as much as I would like to. So anyway, you all are inspiring.
Thank you. Carrie, Diana, let's get Vicky first. No, Carrie first, and then Diana, you're raising your personal hand because you can't raise your Zoom hand. Okay, Carrie, let's go.
Okay. Yeah, I think that anyone can be a braver angels, but not everyone is one yet. I think that some people aren't ready to talk, and that when they're not, we should respect that, and that our energies should be focused on people who are ready to talk, because it's already pretty hard to do. And I've tried to talk to people who were not ready to talk, and it doesn't work out very well for anybody. So I think it takes patience. Don't give up on anybody, but I think it's okay to say today, maybe not.
Thank you, Carrie. Diana, you wanted to say something. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I have been heavily involved in the mental health field because of personal life experience and also current volunteer experience and employment. And it's been my lifelong conclusion that almost all of us, if not all of us, are always trying to do the best we can all of the time. And that's true across the board, no matter whether you're the manipulator, the perpetrator, the victim, whatever. And I think that trying to reach across and understand what's going on, that's the bigger person who can do that. And we all have somewhat of a responsibility to be the one that demonstrates that we are trying to reach out. And if we have that capacity and we're able to do it, then I think we have a responsibility to do it. Not all of us have that capacity. And so if we do, I think we're kind of acting in the place of all those who can't. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana.
And Susan, I did want to also point out that I believe I saw Sheila trying to raise her hand.
So we have three blue hands and Sheila's personal hand.
Okay.
Sheila, you haven't said anything, so why don't you go next? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay. As far as talking to others with whom we disagree, I think all of us could profit by learning how to listen.
Thank you. Vicky, go ahead and unmute yourself.
I found this very powerful, and it's brought up a lot of thoughts I hadn't had on the first reading of this. I want to extend the idea of reaching out to that of the punishment that's going to happen. I don't know anything about what's happened so far in the case, but I'm assured probably that Kyle will go to prison, and we know that the American penal system puts people away and they punish, and they don't try to give people the support, the psychological support to reconstruct their lives so that they can become bona fide members of society again. And I think we should really rethink our penal system and try to make it more humane so that people aren't just put away for life, and that we show the possibility of grace and forgiveness even to the hardest of criminals. I think it's really hard to do that, and I sometimes think of the phrase fake it until you make it. Just try to do it, and maybe eventually we will all feel that in our hearts. Thanks.
Thank you. Susan, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes. Oh, Vicky, that was powerful what you just said, and I agree wholeheartedly. And I also think, as far as always reaching out and finding empathy for people, I also want to try to find empathy for some of the police officers who have been involved in some of these awful incidences and what they're going through. And I think that what brought them to that place is many times brushed over, ignored, and they are just held up as a demon incarnate. And I would like to extend some empathy to them and to understand what they have been through. And I just want to put in a plug for another podcast that's along the lines of Randy's wonderful article, and that's Malcolm Gladwell's podcast. It's an episode called Descend into Particulars. Again, Malcolm Gladwell, Descend into Particulars, and it talks about the Ferguson incident. And as you know, he delves in a very deep way, as Randy did, and it really opened my mind to what happened there. It's much more complex, and I felt empathy on all sides, as Randy's article has made me feel in this case. Yeah, that's
Thank you,
it.
Susan. The name of that podcast, if you don't know, is Revisionist History, Malcolm Gladwell's podcast.
Yes.
So yeah, it's wonderful. Randy, did you want to make some final comments? We have a couple more hands, but I thought you might want to say some sort of.
Yeah, I do. I do have a couple final comments. So I will end with that.
Shall we take them? I'll take these two questions.
Yeah, I think it's not long for my comments. So I do want everyone to be able to say their piece.
Great. Barbara, go ahead and unmute yourself. You're muted, Barbara.
Maybe the I actually have a question for Randy, so you can defer your answer until your final comments. But first, I wanted to thank you for giving us more insight into this set of events than was available and easily available in the media. What was it that led you to look into this more deeply than probably any of the other of us on this call? I was just curious about that. There is something probably that touched you, or that prompted some more deeper insight, because you showed us some things that I had not seen before. But you can wait until your final comments and maybe go with the other question first.
No, that's okay. I mean, it's a great question, and I'm trying to see if I have a screenshot that I took of some of the headlines here. This is it. Let me try to share this right now, because I thought that this was really representative of how this story was presented when it first kind of hit the airwaves. So we see, juxtaposed two Google search results, Google video search results. And the murder charges against Kyle Rittenhouse are a joke. So unequivocally, right, he's perfect self-defense case. And then Trump refuses to condemn the Kenosha shooter, which implies that he obviously should, right? That you know, that this case is ripe for condemnation. And this is exactly how I saw the story being presented. And beyond that, there was so much video evidence out there, right? And I guess maybe in retrospect, I would think, why weren't all these like serious journalists looking at all this video evidence, and how could they possibly come to a conclusion that this was unequivocally this or that? And I think that's probably what drove me to really look that deeply into this.
Deborah, go ahead and unmute yourself, and I guess this will be our last question.
Yeah, I just, as far as reaching out, I feel, well, I'm kind of still new at this. I'm learning a lot. I have my training wheels on. But I feel like there's certain groups of people, for instance, the young men that marched in Charlottesville with those torches, it totally freaked me out. And really, I feel fear when I even think about them. And I don't feel much empathy for them, but I do have a curiosity about how did this happen? How did they get to become aligned with a white supremacist group? And I think they actually identify as that. I'm not categorizing that. I'm pretty sure they see themselves as white supremacists. Maybe I'm wrong. But I'm just curious, Randy, would you speak to somebody like those men in Charlottesville?
Unequivocally, absolutely. And
have you?
I have not. No, I guess I haven't really been presented with the opportunity. But what I would say is something that I say sometimes, which is tough for some people to hear, is that so I come from a Jewish background, and so obviously the events of World War II, the Holocaust, are very personal to me. And at the same time, I do believe that I would sit down with Adolf Hitler and listen to him. I actually have a copy of Mein Kampf on my bookshelf, and I've tried to read it. I couldn't quite get through it because, well, for various reasons. But I don't see listening to someone as being the same as condoning anything that they've done. And I think it's incredibly important that we try to understand people and how they've gotten to that dark place, because when people call Hitler an evil monster, I think it does disservice to what we could possibly learn, to how someone could have a life story that drives them to such horrific acts. But he was still a human being. He was fully human. And I think we really need to understand that deeply. And so that's why I would sit down, and I don't expect everyone to have the same answer that I do, right? I think it's perfectly understandable. I also see myself as relatively at the apex of privilege, right? I am a straight white male. I am protected from a lot of the negative impacts of many people's words and even actions. And so I see it kind of as incumbent upon myself to put myself in that situation and have those conversations, and if I can make a connection with someone and learn from them, but and thereby put them in a posture to be a little bit more open to learn from me, and I can actually make a positive impact on the world in that way, then I think that is part of my responsibility. So yeah, that's why my answer is yes to whoever you would name. Yes, I would.
You're the reason they changed the name from Better Angels to Braver Angels. You're brave, guy. Thank you.
I appreciate that. So I do want to close out with some final words. I would like to read the last sentence of my piece, but I did add on a little bit to it, and so I want to mention that. So I ended the piece by saying, "Let us all make this promise to see the best in one another instead of assuming the worst, lest we help to fulfill our own dark prophecies." And beyond that, I want to say that this I think is a bit reflective of some of the things that came up earlier. This incident to me is both everything wrong with our country and everything right about our country rolled into one. We know all the wrong already, but what about the right? Of when citizens see their community being destroyed and they band together to stop it. And the right of when other citizens see an armed gunman who has just shot someone and they rush toward danger to confront him and remove his gun so he can't hurt anyone else. That's the kind of courage that we applaud during school shootings. Can we see the good in two people who met in a deadly altercation while also seeing the circumstances that led them to that moment and our responsibility to do something about it? Can we spur ourselves to action to confront the sources of our pain without the specter of a villain to blame? And with that, I really thank everyone for coming and engaging in this great conversation. This has been really rewarding for me, and I hope that it's been rewarding for you as well. Thanks.
Randy, thank you so much for all the work you put into this. It's just been extraordinary from the beginning to end. Thank you very much.
And thanks for all the support from everyone who helped to put this together. By the way, I also want to mention a shout out to Mari, who put together the webpage with all the embedded video, and of course to Phil and Gordon, who organized this and got all the invites out and all that stuff. I mean, this has been a real group effort. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you. I think we'll close it there rather than go on and ask for reactions, because it's already a quarter of an hour late, time for supper. But everybody, thank you so much for coming and joining in on this. It was just wonderful. Couldn't have been better. So good night and thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Not all.